Hey everybody, it's Kristen from Magoosh, and today we are going to talk about a really important question in college admissions, and that is, what is the deal with test optional schools? What does that mean, and should you do it? Alright, so recently George Washington University got a lot of press because they announced that they were no longer going to be requiring students to send in SAT or ACT scores in admissions. Now, they are definitely not the first university to do this, but they are one of the largest and the most influential universities to do this, so it brought a lot of attention to this issue and a lot of articles out there with headlines that say, is this the end of the SAT and the ACT? Okay, we're going to talk about whether or not it is the end of the SAT or ACT. Spoiler alert, short answer is no, but I'm going to tell you why. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about what the heck it means to be test optional and whether or not it's a good option for you and how you can find those schools that are test optional. All right, let's go through some terms first. Test optional, test flexible, test required. These are the three basic categories that colleges or universities fall into regarding test scores in the admissions process. So, test optional means just that sending in your SAT or your ACT score is an optional part of admissions. That brings up a lot of tough decisions that you might have to make about whether or not it's good for you to send in your SAT or ACT scores, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Test flexible admissions means that you do have to send some kind of test scores, it just may not be the big dogs of the SAT or the ACT. So for example, some schools will allow you to send in AP scores or IB scores or 3 SAT subject test scores instead of sending in an SAT or ACT score. So it gives you a few more options, a little bit more wiggle room, but testing is still a required part of the process. And then there's just the normal category, test required. A lot of colleges and universities require you to send in SAT or ACT scores or your application is incomplete. But there are over 800 colleges and universities in the US that fall into one of these two categories of being test optional or test flexible. And so if you're a student who feels that no matter how hard you try, your SAT or your ACT scores just aren't lining up with your academic success, then you want to check out some of these schools and see if they are a good option for you. So where can you find them? Well, there's a really great resource called FairTestorg that lists all these schools that have optional or flexible testing policies. So you can go there to start, you can take a look at schools that might interest you, you can search by geographic region, things like that. But then you always want to make sure that you go to the respective colleges or universities' admissions websites, because you may find that the test optional policy doesn't apply to you, and that brings me to my number one reason why SAT and ACT tests are not going away anytime soon, and that is because not all students qualify for test optional admissions. So GW, who I just introduced this video with, it's test optional except for homeschooled students, athletes, and for students applying to their pre-med program. So those are some significant categories of students who still have to submit their SAT or ACT scores. And this applies to a lot of other colleges and universities that advertise themselves as test optional. So you want to make sure that you are not applying to a program or you don't come from a school or a region or a country where test scores are required. Reason number two why the SAT and the ACT are still going to be hanging around for a while is because the majority of students still submit SAT or ACT scores. The number of students taking the SAT or the ACT has risen every single year since these tests were first born. So they're still really popular and they're still a really important part of the admissions process. And so even when schools go test optional, it still means that a lot of students are just submitting their scores. So there's very few colleges out there that just say nobody submit SAT or ACT scores, we're not even going to consider them. So that means that some students are submitting them and they're considered as part of their application and other students are not. So that means you have to make a really important and potentially a difficult decision about whether or not your scores are going to support your application or whether they're going to be bringing it down. And there might be a different answer to that question based on which schools you're applying to on your list. So you probably want to have the SAT or the ACT in your back pocket to be making choices and decisions about which schools you want to be submitting scores to, even if you think test optional is the route for you. The third reason why SAT and ACT are sticking around for a while is because most large state schools require the SAT or the ACT. And the reason for this is because they get so many applications. Last year, UCLA got over 60,000 applications. Penn State, Michigan, large schools like that get over 45,000 applications every year. It's absolutely overwhelming, and these admissions offices need some easy way to be making some comparisons. And so you're not going to see large universities, or I would be very surprised if you saw a large university like that get rid of SAT or ACT score requirements anytime soon. And finally, the reason these tests are not going away right now is because ultra-competitive schools all require the SAT or the ACT. There is just a mystique out there about these tests that, right or wrong, still is very much ingrained in our society, this mystique of the perfect score or a near perfect score. And so that means that the schools that are at the top of the rankings, they all require the SAT or the ACT. The school that's currently highest on the list in terms of national universities that doesn't require test scores is Wake Forest, which is an awesome university, and it's number 27 on the list of national universities in the current US News and World Report rankings, which is very, very, very respectable. It's a fantastic school, but that means there are 26 schools above that that are national universities that are going to make you take these tests. So if you have your eyes set on the Ivy Leagues or other really uber competitive schools, you can bet you are going to be taking the SAT or the ACT for most of them, if not all of them. So even though we are a test prep company, it doesn't mean that we're just going to be in support of the SAT or the ACT for that reason. We are education lovers at Magoosh, and we want to see all students succeed. So we want you to know that you do have some options, and test optional might be a great choice for you. But the fact of the matter is that most students are not going to be able to get away without taking one of these tests, because it's going to be a very rare student that's able to build their list of schools with all test optional schools. And so that means that prepping for the SAT or the ACT and doing the best job you possibly can is going to help you open up your options. Okay, so I hope that helped you get a little bit more knowledge about what all this test optional stuff means for the test industry and for your college admissions. And if you want to learn more about Magoosh, SAT and ACT prep products to help you achieve those dreams, you can check out www.magoosh.com.